Okay, well, thank you very much for inviting me, Paul and Peter and Agnes, and thank you for coming. I'm going to try and sort of paint a rather broader picture about Brexit. I'll start off with one comment that you might expect from a sort of discussant of papers, and then actually try and sort of contextualize some of this stuff. No, which one did we press? That one. I'm going to talk about which Brexit, because that, in a sense, is still what we are talking about, even after a long time. And it is the case that menu is very restricted until further notice. It's sort of the process, it seems, we are now being forced into a series of decisions on rather little information, and we can't pick and choose. That's partly because of the EU, but it's also partly because of domestic political considerations. I'm not a politician, I'm an economist. I'm not going to talk about politics per se, but in a sense, the political constraints are exactly what drives the sort of comments that I'm going to make. But first, the comment really about these papers. I think these are really excellent papers. And the one thing I want to emphasize that they've done is they shift the focus of the conversation away from gross exports. If I had £1 for every time somebody had said, don't worry, we'll export more because we'll devalue, or because we'll negotiate, we'll have trade promotion, or so on, I'd be very rich. In the end, international trade is about getting imports, things that we consume, things that make our life better. Exports just a means to an end. And that's one of the reasons that the terms of trade matter as much as the volume of exports. It's not only how many cars you export, it's the price, and therefore how many things you can import as a strength, on the strength of it. And to say, don't worry, we're going to devalue by 10% and we'll be able to export the same, is just completely not an answer, because you'll buy 10% less imports. Our incomes will go down. The other really important thing is that value added is what drives incomes, and that nets out these things that Peter particularly talked about, the cross borders several times. The issue when you export a car is not what's that car worth here and now as a finished car. The issue is how much income did it generate in your jurisdiction in Britain in order that people can pay to live. And that also is the very interesting thing about Agnes's presentation, now taking changes in trade policy, which are applied sort of to gross trade. The actual value of a car is what you pay tariffs on, but taking it back into where are those incomes created, who gets them, and didn't we need to be thinking about that? Trade policy operates on gross flows, and Peter made the point, these things accumulate. You put stuff in a car, it goes backwards and forwards across the border several times. You may be able to strike some clever bit of tax regulation whereby you don't tax it every time it goes across, but it's got to queue at Dover every time. It almost certainly will incur some administration every time it moves, and you cannot avoid that by smart accountancy. And then finally, we're interested in incomes, and whose income and where they are very important. Remember Mrs. May's speech when she became Prime Minister, the just about managing, very interested in the economics of place. So who and where are critical issues, and that I think is also a matter of congratulations to the IFS team for now tackling that so directly. Okay, so now sort of what's on offer for Brexit. It's 835 days since the referendum, I counted. So where are we now? We started off, we were talking about no deal. There was a little bit of talk about that in the referendum. Either planning a no deal or just crashing out and with a sort of chaotic no deal. There was talk about Canada plus free trade agreements. There was talk about Norway, something like the European Economic Area. Generally, you would expect the process to narrow those set of options down in 835 days of talking and planning and working, but in fact, the opposite's happened. We've really introduced further options, partly political, the outcome of the political process, let me not make a judgment about that, partly perhaps learning about the way the world is. But in particular, and this is right up to the minute, we're talking about Super-Canada now, This is Canada with some infinite number of fantastical pluses that Boris is going to invent for us. And we have the Chequers deal, which Agnes mentioned, which of course is already evolving and that I've christened Super Chequers. I'm sure it won't stick, but we had to find a name somehow. So in a sense, all of these things are possible, and indeed it's even possible that we will remain. As the probability mass pushes out towards the edges of the distribution, the closer we get to no deal and to a chaotic no deal, the more likely indeed that a political process will set up that actually will say, stop this. So in fact, we don't have what you might expect from a process of negotiation, a gradual narrowing down. We have it widening out. Now, to just sort of to paint the picture of, as it were, what are the constraints that the politicians are working in to try and sort of get solutions to these problems. The EU basically determines how this is done. That's partly because it's bigger. It's partly because it's sort of the incumbent. It's their club and we're choosing to leave it. It's partly because the Brits haven't managed to get themselves organised. But essentially, the EU has been very clear. There has to be a legally binding withdrawal agreement, and that will involve citizens' rights, EU citizens in Britain, British citizens in the EU, the budget, and the all-island economy, essentially about the single market. You all have read the newspapers, otherwise you wouldn't be here. Citizens and the budget are more or less sewn up. The real sticking point is the all-island economy. Last December, there was a withdrawal agreement, which is now what is to be translated into legal form, which specified a so-called backstop for the Northern Irish solution that says if nothing better turns up, if you can't do any better, this is how the Northern Irish situation will be agreed. And the British government agreed to that. I mean, they disowned it immediately. They said it's inconceivable that it could happen. Of course we're going to reach a deal. It doesn't. Actually, you need not to worry about it. But now we are 9 months on, it actually is becoming really quite a critical part in that discussion. The UK position, not entirely unreasonably, I should say, is that what we have on the border between the European Union and the UK in Ireland, the land border, ought to be determined by what we do on the rest of the borders. What's the trade arrangement between the EU and the UK? And so that brings us straight back to trade. The EU is not going to sign a withdrawal agreement that doesn't have a solution to Northern Ireland. The UK is very clear that it can't really sign on to a solution to Northern Ireland until it understands what the trade relation is going to be. And we can't make up our mind what sort of trade relation we want. And that's really how it goes into it. The withdrawal agreement will be accompanied by a political declaration which says we expect over the next 21 months or some indefinite period into the future to negotiate a very deep and sophisticated trade relationship, but it's non-binding and it requires quite a lot of trust for that to be valuable. And it's not clear that we should trust an institution that is like the Soviet Union, but it's not clear that people we accuse of being like the Soviet Union should trust us either. So it's difficult. Okay, so ancient history, Chequers, this is now 2 months old. The proposal was, sort of from the white paper about, I think it was the 9th of July, a free flow of goods with the European Union, tariff-free access, and regulatory alignment for those regulations that are checked on the border, not total regulatory alignment. It had this absolutely nightmarish facilitated customs arrangement, which Agnes promised I was going to talk about. I'm not going to talk about it, really. It is fairly nightmarish. It involved being able to decide which tariff was paid when a good entered Britain. You pay the UK tariff if it was going to stay in Britain. You pay the EU tariff if it was going to go on to the EU in some form or the other. And this notion that somehow we would know this in advance, and where we wouldn't know it in advance, we'd follow the good around. And only when it was clear where it ended up would we then make a tariff adjustment. The government's own figures, in fact, suggested that 16% of imports from non-EU sources would be covered by this tracking. They said 4%. That was 4% of total trade, including total British exports, British imports from the EU, none of which were affected by this, and imports from non-EU sources. So when you normalise it up from being 4% of total trade to what percentage of the trade that is actually affected by this policy, it's a sixth. That's the government's figure. It's almost certainly too low. So it is nightmarish. And in fact, it's been declared to be nightmarish by almost everybody in Britain and the EU now. So I'm not really going to talk about it any further, because I don't think it's something that we're going to have to bother about anymore. But what else do we have in the white paper? The notion was, the whole scheme was, we could have frictionless trade with the EU and still sign trade agreements ourselves. But in fact, if to get a trade agreement, to take advantage of having negotiated and given something up to get zero tariff access to the UK market, you had to stick a little sort of tag on your goods when they came into Britain and follow them round into Leeds, or they were screwed into something, into Birmingham, they were screwed into something else, and so on. That's not very attractive. So the idea is very expensive to do. So in fact, the facilitated customs arrangement made signing free trade agreements with Britain pretty unattractive. And therefore, my estimate would be that there would be very few, actually, serious trade agreements under the facilitated customs agreement. It's also true that the white paper offered very little commitment on non-border regulations. Those regulations not covered in the border. And sort of important things that includes are working conditions, all the work, essentially the legislation governing work conditions. It also included environmental conditions. The argument was, you can pollute your air, you can pollute your river, it doesn't affect the good that is crossing the border, so it's not checked at the border. It's governed by a different set of rules. The UK made basically no commitments on it, vague sort of, well, we really wouldn't want to mess things up, would we? The only really solid commitment in the white paper about what we would do is adhere to EU state aid rules. Chequers had very little on services. They confessed they wouldn't not have current levels of access. They would avoid unjustified barriers of discrimination, and coverage would be in line with the General Agreement on Trade in Services, the WTO agreement, which was a fine step forward from nothing, but actually has not achieved very much liberalisation. It adds up to basically nothing on services, I think. Ministers get very upset with me when I say there's nothing on services, and it's true, there is not nothing, there's 18 pages, but it doesn't really add up to very much. And then, of course, what's become clear in the last week is the labour mobility is not going to be treated as a matter of labour market access. Come into our country and have access to our labour market. It's going to be a matter of trade. We will allow you in under some circumstances which we will manage to come and do a particular job. And very often these trade-related elements of labour mobility are tied to that particular job. You do the job, you have to go home. And so it's really a very, very different thing. Okay, so that's really, I think, the summary of Chequers. Now on Super Chequers. So we still have the intention of having the free flow of goods with the EU, tariff-free access, and indeed Mrs. May has now basically declared that, yes, she could see living in a customs union with the European Union into the indefinite future. It's not quite clear, at least to me, whether she's made any concessions about regulatory alignment for border checks, but we presume that that has certainly not gone backwards. It may be that more regulations will be rolled into that. And essentially, it now turns out that Mrs. May is willing to contemplate some sort of inspections in the Irish Sea in order that Northern Ireland can remain part of the single market so far as regulations are concerned. And that does more or less guarantee that the Irish border can be completely open. Doesn't guarantee that the English Channel remains completely open, note. The nightmarish facilitated customs arrangement, I think, has just completely gone. It's replaced by the customs union until technology allows us to negotiate something better. What have we got on the other elements? Independent trade policy. If we're members of the customs union, indefinite. I mean, let's not talk about 10 years from now, but certainly beyond the end of 2020, we can't negotiate trade agreements in goods. We cannot vary our tariffs relative to the EU. No one can negotiate with us on that. So we are left with services-only trade agreements. 151 services agreements registered in the WTO. 150 of them explicitly are attached to a goods agreement. The one that's not attached to a goods agreement is the European Economic Area, which has the deepest connection between services and goods. It just happens to be that administratively, legislatively, goods and services are treated differently. So the truth of the matter is services agreements only occur if you've also got goods agreements. We can't sign goods agreements. Services agreements are difficult. You've got to persuade the universities to behave in a particular way, or you've got to persuade the FCA's, financial regulation authorities, to behave in particular ways. They're difficult, complicated, and it's very unlikely to happen. Working conditions, environmental practices, it seems to me we're really not much further on in those areas. The little on services still stays the same. Labour mobility still stays the same. So we've had some movement in the last week, but essentially always, in a sense, grudgingly, and just to solve the immediate problem of what do we do about Northern Ireland. Now, I want to make the point to you that services really matter, and that ties up very much with Peter and Agnes's presentations. This is actually a table from at least the first draft of Peter's paper, and it's got two very interesting numbers in it. So this is value added, value added from British exports from the different sectors, down the side, down the stub, exported via exports by agriculture, manufacturing and services. And so the first of the numbers I want to point out is 62% of British value added in exports comes from exporting services. The single market in services is certainly not complete, certainly not perfect, but it is by a million miles further than any integration that's ever occurred between sovereign nations previously. We're basically going to drop out of that. That's nearly 2/3 of British exports go out through services. And the other number is this 9.5%. 9.5% of the value added in British exports is services content embodied in manufacturing. If we drop out of the European single market, British service markets are going to become less competitive. The whole point about the single market was you can establish somewhere and sell the service anywhere. And suddenly we're going to be moving out of a market of 500 million people to one of 60 million people. Competition will be a lot less. So services provision in the UK is almost bound to become less efficient. And that potentially will impinge on manufacturing accountancy. Manufacturing. Now, there's also questions of bundling services and goods together. Everybody, I think, knows the example now that you don't ever buy airline engines anymore. You buy airline engine hours. That's the deal. You buy the hours. And it's Rolls-Royce's job to work out how to service the engine, how to make sure you get your hours. It's a service transaction. So our great manufacturing firm actually is basically doing services trade now. If you haven't got an agreement on how to treat the services bit of the package, it's very difficult to imagine that the goods bit of the package is going to carry on unimpeded. And it's also the case that service provision is very dependent on face-to-face contact and labour mobility. All right, there's 100 of you in this room. We could have done all of this electronically. I could have stayed in Sussex, avoided Southern Rail, which is always valuable. And yet here we are in the flesh. That is enough to prove that labour mobility is an important part of services. Now, why does leaving services out of the deal upset the EU? Mr. Barnier has said we really can't imagine signing a deal that allowed the Brits completely unfettered policy discretion in services, but nonetheless free access to the goods market. And the reasons are three, really. First, there's a worry that if Britain can regulate its own services, it will regulate them, what should we say, in a way that allows them to be cheaper. You might reasonably well think that means lower quality, less security, less prudential regulation. But it's a big concern in the EU that they've gone to a lot of trouble to establish minimum levels of provision in services for security for consumers, and the Brits are outside it. They reduce those levels. British services are cheaper. They can then undercut. They're cheaper into UK manufacturing. UK manufacturing goods can undercut the EU manufacturing sector when they trade across this frictionless border. So that is the first thing. Secondly, the European Union has mentioned the concern about bundling services and goods into the same sort of export contract. I've talked about that. It is a real one. And then finally, there is the worry about Northern Ireland. Northern Ireland, in sort of basically the backstop imagination and in the way that Mrs. May is conceiving it, Northern Ireland is intended to be part of the European Union single market. That's essentially what the European Union is insisting on. And the British government is insisting that it be part of the UK single market. No difference between Northern Ireland and the rest of the country. And the problem is, how do you balance that? And at least in some services, it's very, very difficult to imagine how you can achieve that in a way that allows the European single market and the UK single market to remain separate and not have sort of spillover between the two. And that I can show here. Essentially, the UK single market allows free trade in services, lawyer services, shall we say, between London and Belfast. The single market, the European single market, allows free trade in lawyer services, more or less anyway. It has some, subject to some reservations, but basically trade in lawyer services between Dublin and Paris. But then Super-Chequers is suggesting that we should have, Super-Chequers in the sense of having the UK single market preserved means that there has to be free flow between Belfast and Dublin. I guess that's the withdrawal agreement and whatever the British government has to agree. It says because of the all-Ireland market, there has to be a lawyer can work in Belfast and serve Dublin and vice versa. Now, how you are going to tell the difference between a British qualified lawyer who works in London and a British qualified lawyer who works in Belfast, the one of whom strictly isn't allowed into the single market, the second of whom is, because they're in the all-Ireland economy, is just very difficult to work out at all. And so, in fact, the idea that services remain outside the whole deal is going to pose sort of very considerable problems. You can't have an all-Irish market that leaves services separate between the UK and the single market because they can, at least for some of them, can flow through Northern Ireland. And with service provision, in a sense, registered offices, we all know about brass plates, it's going to be more or less impossible. Okay, so this is Monday's slide. I should have updated this. So Chequers is going to evolve or die. It is evolving already, I've said that. And it essentially has to evolve either towards a sort of EEA solution, much closer integration, or towards Super-Canada or WTO rules sort of regulation. If it evolves towards the EEA, we need nearly all a sort of full integration in the goods market so that not only do we need regulations that are checked on the border, but production-type regulations, like you can only throw so much gunk into the air or into the rivers. It needs services integration, as I hope I've shown you. It needs, because the EU defines it this way, labour mobility. If you've got all of those things and goods and services can flow freely between you, you have got to recognise something like the Court of Justice of the European Union, because that's the basis on which disputes are settled. When a British firm supplies an Italian firm with a service and it doesn't do what was promised, we have a legal system at the moment that ultimately that dispute will end up in the Court of Justice. If the Brits are going to remain outside that, the whole of that sort of dispute settlement thing begins to fall apart. And the big problem with services is you can't inspect them in advance of buying them. You sign up for a university education, and then you discover it's not very good. It's only ex post. You've got to have redress systems that command confidence. And so we end up with something like the EEA with Norway, only in fact with a customs union rather than a free trade agreement, which is what the Norwegians have. The alternative is that we evolve towards Super-Canada, Not that Boris has spelt this out, but I'm spelling it out for him. What would it involve? Well, this is sort of basically all the problems with Chequers, plus some more. The Irish border is not solved. We have to have rules of origin in order to see essentially which goods qualify for tariff-free trade. When two countries sign a free trade agreement, they offer tariff-free treatment to the produce of the other partner, not to anything that happens to enter through that partner. So essentially you say, we will accept your goods that you've produced as zero tariff, but we will not allow you to import them and send them straight on at zero tariff, because then you will undermine our own tariff. Those are rules of origin. They're bureaucratic. They involve some inspection at borders, at least in principle, because that's where you have to stop goods that, or actually charge the tariff on goods that don't meet them. They also require border formalities, disruption. There's times in longer times in transit, paperwork. These are all things that create risks. And if we look at sort of the border formalities, the Home Affairs Select Committee reported some numbers. This was about how borders are operated for non-EU lorries coming in from Dover. It takes apparently an hour to decide whether paperwork checks are necessary. It takes 3 hours to do those paperwork checks if they are necessary, 5 hours to do a physical check if the paperwork suggests that you need a physical check. In other words, there's extra time. You probably will have heard the estimates from researchers at Imperial College that anything that added 2 minutes to the throughput of lorries in Dover would lead to 17-mile queues, both sides of the channel in principle. In other words, the fact that there might be a lorry in front of you that is being checked, there are only 4 entries, I gather. The lorries in front of you might get held up, you will be held up. It gets really rather uncertain. Now, all of that is, these are serious disadvantages with Super-Canada. The question, in a sense, is why are we talking about Super-Canada other than Boris Johnson's leadership aspirations? It is true that it's cleaner conceptually and administratively than any of these other intermediate situations, and that's not necessarily to be sniffed at. It also gives us much more freedom to sign free trade agreements and to coordinate our regulations with other countries. We're right outside Europe. We don't have to worry about aligning with their regulations. We could take chlorinated chicken if we wanted, or have different pesticide residue rules and so on. Now, with the freedom comes expense, but I think the basic point is Super-Canada is a model that we actually understand. There are lots of free trade agreements. The problem is that actually Super-Canada, in order to get that distance, to have the clarity, imposes quite a lot of costs on the border. So finally, just a few numbers about how scary Super-Canada really would be. The UK TPO helped a trade association, URIS, conduct a survey of their members. This is the industrial product supply sector. The best way I can describe what these guys produce, they produce all the stuff you can't see in the equipment that you have. They produce the pump that's inside the refrigerator. They produce the plastic wiring that is inside the stuff that you buy, and so on. 148 billions worth of turnover, 1 million employees plus more, account for about 20% of UK exports of goods, so twice the size of the car industry. You've never heard from them. They're lots of little firms, disorganized and so on. So our questionnaire did ask them 34 questions, really, about Brexit. Got a 20% response rate. That was pretty good, and we also did a number of interviews. Just a few key results. Over half of this sector's sales are intermediate inputs. They feed immediately into what Peter was talking about, global or actually European value chains. Over 3/4 of the firms supply over 50 other firms. When you think about the car sector, they sometimes talk about, well, we could really manage this because we've only got a few suppliers, we know lots about them, they're very big transactions, we can get all the bureaucracy done, sort of quietly in the back office and just show it to the government. Not for these guys in the industrial product supply. They're supplying 50 countries. In interviews, they suggested the set of companies that they supply changes quite often. These guys depend on being able to do trade sort of here and now, not to set up sort of grand structures. 83% of the respondents said they would prefer to stick with EU regulation, precisely because their stuff is screwed into European stuff, and European stuff is screwed into their outputs as well. And 77% of the firms said unpredictable border delays were a serious concern for them. If you really knew you were going to have an 8-hour border delay, you could probably build warehouses enough to sort of cope with that. But if you don't know what it's going to be, that is a serious business hazard. 83% of the respondents import inputs from the rest of Europe. Okay, here is value chains in spades. For 75% of imports account for 75% of input costs, I should say, in 20% of the companies. In other words, for some of them constructing stuff, 3/4 of what they actually put together comes from Europe. Most of them, a third of them, didn't know at all whether their goods would ever satisfy European rules of origin. Would their market dry up on them, or would it not? And 57%, more than half of them, didn't know anything about their Tier 2 or Tier 3 suppliers. Rules of origin aren't just who you bought this thing from. You might buy the input from a British firm, but if that firm got it from Europe, or from outside Europe, it counts as non-European input. And so to really manage rules of origin, you need to know not only what you're putting into your product, you need to know where they came from, and in principle, all the way down the chain. So the story basically is that in this quite significant sector of the UK economy, Super Canada is super scary. These guys are really very clear that if we don't have frictionless trade and regulatory alignment, their industry is facing extremely serious adjustments. And that sort of takes us right back to where Agnes was. These are the little engineering companies in Stafford and Gateshead and what have you. This is spread around the country. It's an important part of the economy, which we almost never hear about. Okay, so thank you very much. That's all I had to say.